Yeah, so one of the biggest things we've really done in the new year so far has been to really kind of revamp some of the onboarding information. And so really taking the Pulumi documentation and some of that content and really kind of revamping it, making it easier for folks to get started and learn the product. And so that's really helping the open source project and folks who are coming in and getting started with that to learn about Pulumi, to get started quickly and to find all the different documentation around it. I'll go in a little bit deeper on some of the changes we've made there recently, but let me also just quickly touch on a couple of the other big things from last year. One was we launched the kind of team tier of the product, and so for folks, we've had a bunch of folks now who have been using Pulumi for a while or graduating to use it in production environments, and have been actually jumping over to using kind of the team tier and using some of the additional features there. And we'll talk about some of the new things there in a second as well. And then finally, it's been just the sort of growth of the user base and ecosystem. Really excited about that. Really excited the Pulumi community Slack that I'll jump over to and look at some questions from. It's been great. Tons of folks jumping in there, asking questions, building really cool things on top of Pulumi. Really excited to see the growth in that community over the last few months. So I'll jump into all of those a little bit more in detail in a second. The one other thing that was kind of fun in the end of last year, since we did the live stream last, was we actually spent a bunch of time out at conferences in December and talking about Pulumi with a whole bunch of users, both folks who are already using Pulumi and a lot of folks who aren't yet using Pulumi. And spent a lot of time at reInvent, at KubeCon, at DockerCon EU, and a number of these different conferences. And it was amazing. One of my big takeaways from that was just, almost everyone we talked to at those conferences was really having kind of some of the core problems that Pulumi helps with, managing the enormous complexity of their cloud infrastructure, bringing that under control, applying software engineering practices to it, avoiding just sort of the out of control copy paste. These were things that really were resonating, and it was really great to sort of hear all the different stories of how folks were trying to tackle those problems and how Pulumi was positioned to kind of help them out. And so really want to talk for the rest of the time about some of the different ways in which Pulumi helps out with that and some of the specific challenges that folks have seen. So just to get started, we've done a bunch of things in the product and in sort of the overall experience over the last few weeks, and I wanted to just touch on a few of the most interesting things there, and then I'll talk a little bit later about some of the things that are coming up soon. So the first thing that we've done that I think is really notable is spend some time kind of improving the doc site. And this is a thing where a bunch of users have given us feedback. Hey, we need to have some of this information be a little bit easier to find. And so I've spent some time working on that. And for those who haven't tried it yet, you can go to Pulumi.io, click install, go through the steps to get started. One of the major things we've changed over here as well is just improving the sort of navigation and things. So if I come into documentation, I can drill in, I can go and look at all the command line capabilities, the team and collaboration features that Pulumi offers, as well as things like going to architecture and concepts and doing a deep dive into each of these areas. One of these pages in particular we did a big revamp over is the programming model page. This is from our community Slack and a bunch of the other forums where we're working with users and answering questions for them as they sort of build up larger and larger Pulumi code bases. There's a bunch of questions around the programming model which come up regularly, and so we really wanted to put some effort into making sure that these pages had really good examples and a lot more detail on kind of how to do some of the core things inside your Pulumi program. And so you can come into this page, you can take a look at, hey, if I want to work with creating resources, how do I do that? Resource outputs is a key thing in Pulumi that is kind of how you can stitch together the outputs of one resource to the inputs of another. Generally really important. We have here examples now in all the different supported languages and a whole bunch of details of how to do a variety of different tasks with that. So a lot more detailed documentation there, a really great resource. And then finally, we, our API reference, we've expanded a bit. And so, for example, if I come over into the AWS documentation we have here, and you want to go and learn about what you can do with AWS using Pulumi, we have now, these things are collapsible, so you can quickly go and look at just the pieces you care about. Here you can see just all the capabilities of AWS that are exposed into Pulumi, and there's a couple of interesting things here. One, you can see several features that are sort of new things that have been released since reInvent. So just in the last few weeks that we have exposed through to Pulumi users, like AppMesh I think was announced at reInvent, and DocumentDB was announced even more frequently just a couple weeks ago. So these capabilities are all here for Pulumi users of AWS. But the interesting thing is I can come in here as well and dive into class table. We've actually now added examples into a lot of the documentation here, and so here's an example where I can get documentation of what it looks like to use a DynamoDB table in one use case, and this sort of just gives me a simple access to a working example of the full thing. Very, very important, something users have asked us for a long time. I can also go and do things like billing mode. I can go and search for that property. One of the other things that AWS announced at reInvent was the sort of on-demand pricing model for DynamoDB, and this is something that a lot of I was very excited about. A lot of users were very excited about. We can go and see that that's now available as the pay-per-request option on billing mode. We can also see from this that we can do things like hover over and click on Pulumi.output to go and learn about what Pulumi.output does, and that links us to that. So we've made just generally this documentation quite a bit easier and richer to use. We can also do things like, say, we have the on-event handler on tables. This is, lets me fire an event anytime using DynamoDB streams. And so I can do things like click on this to go and see what that signature looks like, find this table event, which has all the details of the structure of these events. And I can click through here, get all this information right inside the documentation. So a lot of work on the API documentation to make that really great. Another thing that we did recently was bring in support for additional login options. And so you may have seen in the past we supported GitHub as the way you can sort of log into the Pulumi backend. And so if I go to app.pulumi.com in a fresh window here, you'll actually see we can now log in with both GitHub and GitLab. And so we've had many users now who had been asking us about GitLab, who are using GitLab as their primary kind of source control and identity. And so now folks who have GitLab identities can also sign in here. We're working on Atlassian as well right now, and that should be available very soon. And so we're trying to make it so it's really easy to log in here. We're not just tied to kind of GitHub. We have a variety of different providers. And of course, in our folks who are using Pulumi inside an enterprise setting can use kind of the SAML sign-on as well. And so I think that's really nice. And then I'll show kind of one other feature which we just kind of announced today, and I'll just go over to the blog to show a little bit about that, is webhooks. And so this has been in the product for about a week. We just kind of put out a blog post that really walks through kind of some of the how you can use webhooks earlier today. And webhooks is a feature we've had quite a lot of asks for. It's just the ability to hook up a webhook to your stack so that you get events sent to you every time there's an update or a preview or any of those kind of actions on your stack, so that you can do additional things. You can either log that into Slack or some channel like that. You can do additional work that you might need to do in your sort of deployment and processing stack. There's a variety of different scenarios that we've seen folks try to use for webhooks, but this provides a key point of extensibility for use with the Pulumi backend. And so this is a really nice kind of feature. One of the things I thought I'd do is just really quickly show the end-to-end, because it also shows off kind of using building a Pulumi program to hook up webhooks. So I can go over to app.pulumi.com. I can log in and I can go to my Pulumi account. And this is our internal account for the Pulumi team, and so we've got a whole bunch of examples deployed here. And I can come over to settings, and I actually now have this new webhooks pane. And so you see we actually have ourselves, for our own team, we've got to post updates to Slack webhooks, so we've got this hooked up for some of our own webhooks for our own sort of use cases internally in our team. But we have a number of Pulumi customers who are doing similar things to this as well, who've helped get set up on top of this. But I can go and create a new one as well, and so I can say, Luke's demo webhook. And then I need a payload URL. And so to do this, I need sort of some web API, some HTTP endpoint on the internet that I can send these requests to. And of course, that's something that Pulumi is great at doing. So I'm going to say, demo webhook. I'll just go and create this, and then I'll just say Pulumi new to create one. Let me just come over here and do AWS TypeScript. I'll just pick all the default options here. And this is just going to template out a new Pulumi project. And I'm going to use this project just to really simply create a web API that I can run that can handle this, and then I can go and make that richer over time if I want to. So let me just go ahead and create this. Say yes. You notice some of these warnings are actually just because I have a dev build installed locally, and so I'm getting some warnings, but they shouldn't, end users wouldn't see these things. This is just because I'm working on recent bits. So okay, so I've got this created. In fact, if I come over here and click on this, you can see I've already deployed a very simple app to this demo webhook thing. But let me just open this up in Visual Studio Code. And let's just look at this program. Okay, so I've got this little program right now. It's just got a S3 bucket exposed. I don't need that, so instead I'm going to do something simple. I'm going to just say const API equals new AWS.API gateway. We've got this handy, API gateway.x.api, which makes it really easy to stand up a new API. And it's got a few different things I can set. I can pass a Swagger string that I build out myself, or I can just pass a set of routes. And so in this case, I'm going to pass a route, and I'm going to say, when I post, because I think the webhooks use post, to the root path, then I want to run this event handler. And so for right now, I'll just say console.log ev, and then I actually need to return the shape that it requires. So I'm going to say status code 200 and body okay. So I think the webhooks expect me to return a 200, or else they'll try and do some retries and things. But this is a simple handler, and so now I'll just say export const URL equals API.url. Okay, so this is a very simple Pulumi program. Just exposes a REST API at this URL that we'll export, and hosts a single API on that, a post to the root path that's going to run this code. It's just going to console.log the event and then grab this. Okay, so let's come back over here and just say Pulumi up. And we'll see, as usual, Pulumi will do a preview of this deployment. Okay, so it's going to create these 8 resources associated with this, so some AWS resources to make that API gateway, and it's going to delete the bucket that was there temporarily as part of the simple thing. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, this will just take probably 20-30 seconds. There we go. Yeah, 21 seconds. And so now we've updated that. We can see over here we did this update. We can see all the details of what was changed there. So we actually now have a simpler view here, and then all the details of the resources there as well. And finally, the links over into I can go and see each of these resources in AWS. But the really important thing is that I have this URL here now. And so if I curl this URL, for example, you'll see we get back that hello world that we wrote in the code. So this is now an endpoint exposed on the internet that we can send requests to. And I can just also go and do something like Pulumi logs. And Pulumi logs-f, this will actually give me the logs from this application. And so since I hit that endpoint and I console.log the event, we see here that's actually that console.logged event payload is all going to be in my logs here. So I can actually see the logs of what requests have been made to my endpoint. So I'll just hit cancel there. Okay, but the key thing is now I have that endpoint here. So this endpoint right here. So I'll go back to my webhook. Where was my webhook? Right here. And I'll just go and say I want the payload URL to be that. And I'm not going to set any secret right now. We do have the ability to kind of set a secret, which will then ensure that we pass a sort of HMAC digest of that to your handler, so you can verify that it was really sent from Pulumi and is correct. This would be, since this endpoint is something which any of you could right now be sending requests to. We want to be able to make sure eventually that if we're getting the requests, that they're things that are guaranteed to be from Pulumi. And so you can definitely do that. For this simple example, I won't. We have an example linked from the blogs that shows how to hook that up correctly as well. Okay, so right, so now I have that set up, and what I want to do is, what I'll actually do is I'll create another instance of this same stack, but I'll create an instance of this. If you look at my Pulumi stack ls, we'll actually see that this is in my Luke Hoban organization, my own personal organization, but I can create an instance of this stack in Pulumi. So I can say Pulumi webhook. So now I'll have two different stacks, and if I do Pulumi stack ls, you now see I've got two different stacks, the Luke Hoban webhook dev and the Pulumi demo webhook dev. And so if I do Pulumi up here, this will actually deploy this app into the new stack. So I'll just go ahead and say yes, since now I've got two copies of this stood up. And the reason I'm doing this is because this will actually trigger those webhooks, because I'm creating a stack, I'm doing some events on it. And so if I come over here, we'll now see, if I refresh this page, I can actually see the events that have been sent to it. And so here, if I click on this, we'll actually see that this was a update succeeded with creating 9 resources. And we'll see that my webhook, oh, actually this is not the webhook I was looking at. I don't know. But I can see if I come over here and I go to my other stack, so I'll go over to webhook dev. And now if I do Pulumi logs-f, we'll actually see we got quite a few hits here. So we got this kind of body that's encrypted here. Actually, since I want to show the body, well, I could actually go and grab the body. This looks like it's base64 encoded or something here. So I could unencode this, and we'd see this was actually the payload, the same payload that we got sent over here. But the key thing is here, we're actually getting to this endpoint that I created. We're actually getting these things delivered on every time I do some sort of update. And so each of these is a different, an update succeeded, and this one is a, created a new stack. And so each of these different events with their payload is being sent to my handler. So two key things I think showing off there. One is, this ability to have webhooks and the ability to sort of manage them, and a bunch of different integrations we can do with those, including like Slack and workflows and that kind of thing. But the other is just the ability to really simply stand up a REST API kind of using Pulumi. Both stand up the infrastructure for it, in this case the API, but then also write the code that's going to be implemented in here. And of course I can then go and sort of say const table equals new aws.dynamodb.table. And I can set that up as well to be a data store, and then if I want, I can actually keep some store some data into that using the AWS SDK as part of my implementation of this Lambda. So I can actually have a stateful application here as well, really simply kind of using Pulumi. We can dive into that more if folks are interested at some other point. But anyway, that was a quick tour of kind of using webhooks, both using webhooks in the service and in the backend. So if there are any questions that have come in, I'll definitely jump over and kind of look at some of those right now. Otherwise, I'll answer a couple of other things that we've got backed up. All right, I don't see any questions right now, so I'll go back to a few of the things that have come up over the last week or so that I thought were kind of interesting, and spend a little time talking about those. So one of them was got some questions about auto naming, and in particular, let me see where those were back here. Yeah, so I think Felix had asked these questions about Pulumi's adding random numbers to the AWS resources. And is there any way to prevent the sort of random number, in this case, my table 314142, is there any way to prevent that from happening? And so let me just talk a little bit about that and about kind of why that is and why it's interesting. So we see in this piece of code here, we created a Pulumi resource called API. And when I look over at what I did in the CLI here, you can sort of say Pulumi Well, actually, what I'll do is just jump over into the web console. And we can see these resources. Yeah, this might not be these, but let me just do. Yeah, so these resources each, have a Pulumi name like API, but then they also, have a generated name for their ID. So, in this case, it's API dash and then some random digits here as well. The reason why we do that is to make sure that when you create one of these resources, we want to make sure it's unique inside the cloud provider. We want you to be able to deploy this same program multiple times without conflicting on the names. And we also want to be able to make sure that when we replace one of these resources, if you make some change that requires us to replace it, that we can cleanly create the new one before we delete the old one. And this is actually a really important capability to be able to create the new one before we delete the old one. For example, in this API case, if I make a change to this, like this'll. Well, actually, why don't I just let's imagine that I add a new handler here. I'll just kind of do the exact same thing here. So if I do this, now I've updated the handler, and I come down here and I say Pulumi update. We'll actually see, we'll get a preview of what changes this is going to make to my stack. And you'll see it's doing actually quite a few different things inside the implementation of this API. And in fact, it's replacing the deployment, it's replacing the permissions, and it's going to update then the REST API in the stage to kind of point to that. And because we create on all these replacements, like the replacement of this deployment, because we do that replacement, we do the creation before the deletion, it means we can actually create the new deployment, update the stage to point to that, and then delete the old deployment without any downtime on that API. And that ensures that anytime anyone hits that endpoint, they're going to get the correct result. We're going to correctly shift over to the new one only after it's completely stood up. Were we to have to create a new one with a new name, we wouldn't be able to do that coordination. And so it's actually very important, this ability to generate unique names for these is actually very important to be able to have really good uptime during updates. And that's why we do that by default. Now, it is possible, though, to pick that name explicitly yourself. And so if I go back and do that table, aws.dynamodb.table, I can come over here, for example, and say name : and I think there's some other, let me just make this correct so I can show you what this does. Attributes and hash keys. So I want to do attributes. Okay, let me just put the attributes, and hash key is going to be ID. Okay, so there's a minimal, and I'll just say billing mode pay per request, so I get to use the nice features there. Okay, so this is a DynamoDB table I'm going to create. In this case, I'm going to say name hello. So the Pulumi name for it is going to be table, but I'm going to say its name is hello. And what we'll see if I do this is when I do Pulumi up, this will actually show in the preview, it'll actually show that the resource I'm going to create for this Dynamo table is actually going to be named exactly hello. It's not going to have the randomness added to it. I'm not sure why this is taking time. I'll just, well, let me see. Let me start with the diff. All right, so we're going to create a table way up here. Yeah, here's the table. So we're going to create this table, and we'll see that its name is actually hello. And so it's going to be created with that name. If I went ahead and created this, I'd actually create that table, with that name. Let me actually just remove this, and I'll just go ahead and do it. Okay, I'll go ahead and create this, and we'll see this will create the DynamoDB table. Shouldn't take very long. And then if we go over to the AWS console, we'll see it's actually named hello. So we'll come in here, go to resources, find our table, click over to the AWS console. And we're on the hello table, so its name is exactly hello. You'll see a lot of these other ones we have these sort of random hex at the end, but this hello table was exactly named hello table. If we come and remove that though, then I'll do a Pulumi update. Now, because this is changing the identity of this thing, it'll actually require that we replace it, and so we should see a replacement. Looks like it didn't see the change at all. Okay, not sure what went on there. But anyway, I think folks get the point that we were able to use the explicit name colon to name the table in this case. And we can do that for any AWS resource, really any resource we want, if we want to explicitly name it and get a specific name. But for the most part, we encourage folks not to do that because that does make it harder to get zero downtime replacements. Okay, let me just jump over, see if there's any other questions here. So one other question we had just did in the last couple of days was about using kind of get output. So let me talk a little bit about that as well. Let's see where that was here. Right, so we had someone asking about using a new feature that we actually deployed called stack reference. And one of the things I'll just quickly show off kind of how that works. So we added this new feature. We've got a number of users have pointed out they're kind of using multiple Pulumi stacks, and each stack is sort of one deployed and versioned kind of unit of code, but many folks want to split up their applications into multiple stacks. So they'll have one which is maybe their networking layer, one which is their core infrastructure, maybe their Kubernetes cluster, and then one which is their sort of each of their applications maybe is its own stack. But as they do this, they kind of want to reference things from the lower layer. So they want their application stack to reference the outputs of the maybe the Kubernetes cluster stack, so they can figure out which cluster to deploy into. And so they want to actually have links between different stacks they have deployed. And so we actually added the ability to kind of do that. And so if I want to say base stack equals new Pulumi dot stack reference, and so this will now be a kind of reference to that underlying, the stack that's stored somewhere else. And I can go over and pick anything that I have defined inside an organization. So anything I have access to from within Pulumi, I can reference. And so I can say, maybe I want to take this Luke Airflow stack. So I can just grab its name. And I can say name colon and grab that. If it was something in the Pulumi organization, so for example, if I had it in an organization I own, I could grab over this, and I could grab Pulumi slash, and so now I can reference that example as well. And so this lets me just say I want to grab a reference to that thing, and now I can look. This particular example has a bucket name output, and so I could then say base stack dot get output, bucket name. And this is now going to be a reference to this value. And so if I updated that underlying stack and then redeployed this, we would see a delta there, and we'd have to then go and push that delta through our stack as well. But this is a way of sort of chaining stacks together in kind of a really nice way. And so now I've got my bucket name. And now I could use that, maybe in here I can then go and, AWS.SDK. I could use that to sort of I could put a put object. So I could call s3.put object and pass in that bucket name and put an object into that bucket every time this event gets fired or something. And so this is a way of me chaining together resources defined in multiple stacks in a really convenient way. Something we added, I think, in December. We've seen a lot of folks picking that up and using it since then. And so I had a few questions of folks kind of troubleshooting how to do things there. We had other questions. I think there was one this morning about kind of how to do some event-driven serverless solutions on AWS. I think this is always a really interesting thing. I think this is a place where Pulumi can be really nice. I mean, this example I showed with the webhook is actually kind of like that. It's event-driven in the sense of creating this REST API. But it's also kind of amazing. You know, I created this table here. You can also do things like, say, table.onEvent. You know, and this is using the streaming. And so I think I have to turn on streaming. So stream enabled true. But now I can say, you know, on event. And again, I can do sort of async EV. You know, and just with this code, actually, it's one more thing I need. I need to say starting position. I have to pick whether starting position is either trim horizon or latest. This is just part of the DynamoDB streams model. Is I need to pick kind of how it seeds the stream. But just with this, you know, a couple lines of code, I've actually hooked up a callback and lambda to, you know, whatever's happening in that table. So every time some operation happens to modify that table, I'm getting an event, and I can go and do interesting things with those. Do some post processing, do some, you know, whatever it is I want to do. It's really easy to get into kind of using event-driven serverless things. Either this kind of event-driven on tables, event-driven on buckets, event-driven on timers, just any of the kind of standard event-driven things. And also very easy to just incorporate this into existing infrastructure. And so I think this is kind of a really nice scenario. All right, and then the last thing I want to talk about, I kind of briefly, we had a couple of questions just in the last few days just about working with outputs. I think there's this one here, you know, someone's looking for how do I do kind of JSON stringify, but do it when I'm trying to stringify something that has outputs inside it. This is actually something that we now do have a lot more kind of documentation and things on inside this programming model section. And so resource outputs. So a lot of different examples kind of here of how to do various things. But let me just show kind of a couple of those in the context of this program that we have here, just to give a sense. So for folks who are kind of new to Pulumi, one of the things that you'll see a lot working with Pulumi is this notion of Pulumi.output. And that is sort of, this is something that we expose in all the different languages that we have in JavaScript, Python, and Go. And of course, it's more explicit in TypeScript here, where it's in the types of the thing. But these Pulumi.outputs are the way that we take, you know, when I create this API, there's going to be some properties of it, like the URL, that are not known until it actually gets deployed. And so they're not known right away, but they will be known as the program kind of deploys itself into your infrastructure. And so if you want to write arbitrary code that sort of operates in here, you need to be able to do that as, you know, only once that value is available. And so if I want to do something with that URL, I need to do it only once it's available. And this is where apply comes in. And so you'll see for something that's an output, we've got this apply method on it, and I can just say, you know, URL goes to maybe a console.log it. And so what this will do is when that URL becomes available, we'll go ahead and run this console.log. And so the first time I deploy the application, it won't be available until it actually deploys that. And in later times, if it needs to replace it, this will wait until it replaces it. Otherwise, it'll use the existing URL. And so this is a core thing you need to be able to do to compose values together. But a really common thing that folks want to do is sort of compose more interesting things. And so, for example, they might want to say, you know, I don't know, they want to say let's other URL equals, you know, and they might want to say something like this. They want to do some string concatenation, for example, where they concatenate, you know, hello, and then put the URL inside it. And so that's another case where you can use apply. And similarly, you might want to do, you know, JSON.stringify, and maybe this URL is actually a rich object. In this case, you know, it's a string, but maybe there's the one on here that is not. Yeah, so I mean, stage, for example. Well, stage is not. I guess none of these are that interesting of objects. But if I did have some rich object, I might want to JSON stringify it, for example, and so I can do that as well, kind of inside an apply. And so you can learn a lot about the different ways you can sort of use apply and some of the other building blocks around that inside these documentation pages here. But that's a topic that comes up a fair bit here as well. Okay, so that I think may be it for today. Covered a bunch of different topics about what's new and some of the kind of questions that have come up recently. If folks have any other questions or things they're interested in, definitely drop us a note in the community Slack, and we'll be excited to come back next week and talk about some of the new things that we're doing with Pulumi. Great, thanks to everyone for joining us. We'll see you again next time. Bye, everyone.